I know that you and I both consider ourselves evangelicals, but since 2016, there's been a lot of chatter around the term evangelical. I still consider myself an evangelical, namely for theological reasons, but it seems like the baggage around the term, especially as it's affiliated with a strong kind of partisanship, seems to be hindering Christian witness today. Apart from like in-house discussions among evangelicals to the broader world, evangelical actually communicates something pretty negative, deeply partisan, and something that doesn't seem to really exhibit the love and the gospel message of Christ. First of all, I'd be curious, why do you still consider yourself an evangelical? And what are the things that you think we need to address in order for us to get back to an evangelicalism that's truly gospel-centered and kingdom-focused?
Yeah, so I think for the broader public, increasingly over time, evangelical means largely white Republicans and those who want to be like them. I consider myself an evangelical because that's a term that's been hijacked. That's not what an evangelical is, even if that's what it gets associated with, essentially as a political movement. We know it's a religious movement that values and takes seriously the Bible, its teachings, the whole spectrum of it, and caring about others, sharing the faith. So I'm not giving up on that. I refuse to let that term, which has identified me since I was a junior in high school, to be taken away by a select group of people.
Now, you're also a Christian sociologist who really focuses on the topic of race. Could you tell us why you spend so much energy on race and why you're so committed to the topic?
We have injustice, and it is amazing if you just say, does God care about justice? Because, of course, if you grew up in traditional evangelical circles, you don't hear much talk about that. But if you just say, I'm going to do a biblical study, I personally was blown away how much God cares about justice. So what kind of justice cares about it all? But the fundamental injustice of this country, upon what it was founded, what impacts us every day that this United States has ever existed, is racial injustice. And I think that sociological study founded with commitment to trying to be true to the biblical teaching, merging those two is why I work and am so concerned about this very issue.
Now, as I've come to know you, I mean, your deep commitment to your faith, it just exudes out of you, especially as people get to know you personally. They see the fruit of the Spirit kind of come through, and I've been deeply appreciative of that. But not only are you a deeply committed Christian, you're also a very well-respected sociologist. And in the broad evangelical mind, these two things don't often seem to be compatible. I can't tell you how often I hear a comment about Christian sociologists to be something of like a second-class Christian because they're focused on things that are too worldly. Could you tell us where that comes from? Why are so many evangelicals of a certain stripe so weary of sociology? And then can you tell us how you see your faith to be compatible with your area of study?
If you look at what U.S. Christianity has been, especially U.S. white Christianity, it's individually centered, right? It's about us having an individual relationship with Christ and then individual relationships with each other. So we care deeply about people, but we're very, very mistrustful about anything that goes beyond the individual and the family. Words like socialism are essentially cuss words in this world, right? So sociology, first of all, sounds too much like socialism, just the title. But the project of sociology says that fundamentally we study groups of people and how groups interrelate and how inequalities can be created from that. That kind of project just can seem counterintuitive to the fundamental project of evangelicalism as it has been practiced traditionally in the U.S. What I'm saying is the combination of more and more, and I see this with younger evangelicals in particular, that isn't biblical. The individual matters, but the individual is part of the story. God is constantly talking to groups of people. He's even judging whole groups of people because of something somebody does. And saying generations that have nothing to do with what you just did are now going to suffer. So we are interconnected. That's the way God created us. That's why, for me, the project of sociology gives me a lens to better understand my faith, even as I know people often can have mistrust of that.
No, that's very helpful. I think that the hyper individualism, namely driven by kind of like an emphasis on personal and individual conversion, which every Christian agrees to,
Yeah.
seems to
Mm-hmm.
exclude and limit kind of like a communal identity, which, as you said, is all throughout Scripture. I mean, God calls Israel, right? It's an
Yeah.
entire
Yeah.
collective. It's an entire group of people, and in some ways, if the leaders of Israel fail, the people suffer and struggle. When the people of Israel fail, the leaders also bear the cost of it. And you see that happen over and over throughout Scripture. But one of the things that I think is intriguing is that you said that you're called to live as a minority. What does that mean, and what does that actually look like? Because I think when you talk to a lot of white Christians in America, I think that they might understand on some level what it's like to be uh, bullied or marginalized along certain aspects, but maybe not understand what it actually means to live as like a racialized minority. And I'd be curious if you could kind of share a little bit more about that with us.
Mm-hmm. When I heard that call clearly, I really didn't know exactly what that was going to entail. Uh, but of course, God revealed that one step at a time. So what that has meant is live as a racial minority always in the neighborhoods that we are in. It's always majority other groups. It's also meant where we go to church. It means where our children have been educated. It means the friendships we formed. The thing about it, looking back, of course, is God is using that to allow me and our family to see what racial minorities in this country feel every single day. It's never the same, right? Because I could always just walk away and say, enough of that. Whereas racial minorities cannot. But to be the minority racially I had to experience it that way. I didn't know it at the time, but that's what God was doing. That gave me an insight into seeing things I could never have seen before and to write about things I never could have done otherwise.
What have been some of the challenges that you faced because of your engagement on the issue, or because of the decisions that you made to follow God's call in your life? And is it a call that just specific to you? And do you need some sort of supernatural intervention to fulfill that call? Or should other white Christians who don't necessarily have a strong kind of pull consider this as well?
Yeah, all Christians should consider it. I may not have a specific call to, I don't know, to be an evangelist, but I still am called to evangelize. I mean, we have some people we call evangelists, but it doesn't mean I am not supposed to share my faith as well. So even if you don't feel like this is a specific call in the sense that my family had, it's still what we must do to address issues of racism and racial inequality that plague our country. I mean, in severe ways. Even right now, when we're talking about all the things we're going through right now with COVID, right? This grotesque racial disparities that we're finding. And we could have predicted this, of course. And somehow it's just not okay. But anyway, I won't go there. Yes, people are called to it. Do you pay a price of some sort? Yes, of course. I can remember when we made this decision. It was amazing how many people grew angry with us. People that we were very close to in our essentially all white Christian world. Like they couldn't understand it, but they also saw it as a rejection of, or somehow walking away from the faith. Like, how could that be more important than the Christianity we're practicing here together? So that was hard because it was people like literally refusing to talk to us or no longer trusting us. Um, but I said, we've been doing it long enough. So our children now are all in their 20s. And one of the things I know we worried about growing up is we're asking a lot of our children. And it was very extreme for them, such that for most of their time in school growing up, they were literally the only white student in school. So we wondered what it's going to be the impact for them. When we ask them now, every single one of them says, I wouldn't trade that for the world. Our oldest, in fact, is a pastor doing multiracial ministry by choice, and he's actually moved back to the neighborhood we started in. So we are very grateful. I remember John Perkins telling me early on, I was telling him a story in our call, and he said, I will guarantee you this, if you're faithful to that call, God will bless your children. And we've seen it.
Now, my guessing is that that blessing hasn't necessarily been financial. It's probably been blessings in
Nope.
other way. Can you maybe share about those blessings and how you've seen God bless them specifically in that sense?
Mm-hmm. We have 4 children, and we didn't have essentially a single rebellious child, partly because we had to cling together very closely as a family, going through things, often feeling like, well, clearly being the minority. So we were very tight as a family. We relied on each other. So we were very close. That was one of the blessings. The other blessing is that all of our children are following God. All learned that the deep, because we were doing something that others didn't understand, particularly people in our larger family and friendships. Why? Well, it always came back to because this is our faith. So their faith became built right into their identity. I think they wouldn't have a clue how to operate apart from that faith.
Now, what are some of I know that you've shared both privately to me and then also kind of in other kind of settings where you've spoken on the issue of the cost that you've borne, including real estate prices and other things, friendships. I mean, I don't know if everyone who's listening in has heard that or are familiar with that, but maybe it would be helpful for people to see what kind of tangible costs are associated with following Christ to pursue justice along racial lines.
One of the fundamental lessons that I learned, and I'm sure this is what God wanted to teach us, I represent everything that says that this society promises will lead for tangible financial economic success. I am white, I'm male, I am married, I have a Ph.D, I am a professor, I'm as highly educated as you can be. I've worked at very well-known, prestigious universities. But the lesson I learned is none of those individual achievements that I am promised count as everything, could overcome the fact that I did not play the communal game that we're supposed to play, that I'm supposed to play. I am supposed to move into a white neighborhood and send my children to the very best schools, which is usually defined as mostly white, right? High test scores, all that. I'm supposed to go to church with mostly whites and make those connections. I didn't do any of that. And so just the examples, basically every time we've ever sold a house, we've lost money. And then our most recent one was very, very costly because we lived in a neighborhood that was 96% Black and Hispanic, 80% Black, 16% Hispanic, 4% other. We attempted to sell our house in 2012, and we found a buyer to buy it for $50,000 less than we had purchased for it 7 years earlier. So we're going to lose money there. But then the appraiser, who never comes to our house, simply says, you can't sell it for that. Your house isn't worth that. And why is our house not worth that? There's nothing individual here. Our house isn't worth it because we play a secret communal game that says your house is only worth what every other house around you is worth, and every other house around you is worth less because of who lives there. Now, I know some people might be listening and say, oh, how do you know that? Well, I know that because I assigned my graduate students to study this. And then we have another study in Milwaukee. So we have a study in Milwaukee and a very recent study here in Houston that find that the fundamental factor in appraisals, the strongest predictor of what a house is worth, is what is the racial composition of the neighborhood, not the quality of the homes, not the quality of the schools, nothing. If you are in a majority minority neighborhood, your house is worth less. Doesn't matter if you are me. So in the end, instead of $50,000 less, we had to sell it for $115,000 less, which was less than what we actually owed on the house. So we had to do something called a short sale. Then we found out, because you do a short sale, the government penalizes you. So for the next 4 years, we couldn't get a loan for a house. Then when we were finally ready to get a house loan, we found out, oh, if you want the size of a house loan you're looking for, which is the size I needed to get a house in Chicago, that's 7 years you have to wait. So that was 2012. Just a couple of months ago did we finally able to get a loan for a house. 7 years of waiting.
I mean, that's basically spectacular. There's no really other way of describing it. It's systemic, because this does plague especially Black and brown communities throughout the country, and so it's almost like you're in a hamster wheel that you can't get out of. But it also, I wonder if there's some people that might be listening that says, man, that's also your privilege as a white person to be able to do that. How would you respond to someone saying, man, that's just your version of a white privilege?
So losing money is white privilege. I'm trying to understand your question. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like you could choose to exit out of the game at any point. And maybe the question is, I mean, at the end of the day, the individual cost is true, but at the same time, there's this collective reality that you can't escape, or that you can escape, but that other people can't. And I think there's a lot of criticism sometimes when white people enter into a conversation and people know that they can leave.
Because I'm white, I still get privilege. It doesn't matter. What I'm saying is I can lose many of the privileges of being white, but I still can get the respect walking into a grocery store, or the assumption that I'm not a criminal from the get-go, no matter where I am, right? So I don't even pretend to think that. I'm just saying the thing that God has taught us through this is you cannot overcome the systematic issues that this country has just by your individual characteristics. You can't. You can gain some benefits. I get it. I will always gain benefits by being white. But that's not even enough to overcome this losing of money continually by this system that devalues minority neighborhoods.
When people start talking about race, it seems like you also have to talk about whiteness. But people don't really seem to understand what whiteness is. Can you explain what whiteness is and why evangelical Christians should be exploring both the topic of race and more specifically the topic of whiteness?
That is such a great question, because right now we're working on writing some books, and we said together, the research team, I said, well, what's the definition of whiteness? So we started looking, and you know what? We couldn't find one. What we find is just people assuming whiteness is something. So I'll do my best here. Whiteness gets used in many ways, but whiteness is, I'll say it's shorthand for white superiority, white supremacy, white domination, white privilege, white fragility. There's all of these things put together that means whiteness. It's there's a hierarchy, and it means whites are always on top. It means other groups are always struggling to be the most favored people of white folks. It means a sense of rightness and superiority. It means that you don't even have to ever think you are white, because you're just human. You don't have a culture. You just have American culture. It means you get to see all of those things as exactly the same. It also means the privilege to tell other people, stop complaining, work harder, the system is fair, and to make those folks feel bad when they try to tell you, that's not how I'm experiencing the world. You have the power to simply shut them down and say, no, my definition of the world is correct. Yours is incorrect.
Oh, that's very good. And I think it's very helpful, because I think that you can't separate the conversation around whiteness from the hierarchy that you mentioned, and from power, and from whatever is deemed normative. But there are other people that might say, well, every culture has a dominant group and subdominant groups within it. Every culture has someone that's like considered normal. What is it about whiteness that's so unique?
Because whiteness is a world global project that's been in process for several hundred years. So whiteness dominates anywhere it exists. Whiteness even dominates where it isn't, as people stay in Asia are spending inordinate amounts of money to make their skin whiter. Why are they doing that? Because white is seen anywhere and everywhere as better, because white Europeans have colonized, dominated. I mean, all these words, right, for white folks are liberal. That's what I would ask my white brothers and sisters. Just stop being defensive. Let's trust our Christian brothers and sisters of color, hear what they are saying, and think about it. You find out they're speaking truth. I don't know what else to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about, the first century, when Jesus came, to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, Jesus was a liberal, as liberal as it got. And so I think that, the way that the term has been hijacked by partisan politics is troublesome, and these false binaries that we've kind of fallen into are very problematic. And, in the way that we're working through kind of and navigating our own society, one of the things I can say is that the far left and the far right politically are very dangerous places to be. But it does seem like Christians overall don't really have a problem with the far left, because that's not really within the evangelical world. We have far more challenges with the far right, which is where I think a lot of the challenges are emerging. Could you share some of the data that you're finding around Asian American Christians, Asian American evangelicals, especially on issues of race?
So we've been doing for the last year and a half or so what we think is the largest study ever conducted on race and religion in the U.S., specifically focusing on Christians. And we have a big enough sets of samples to be able to compare to non-Christians, different types of Christians, Catholic, so on. When we look by race, we find that on issues, all the issues of race, all the issues of immigration, things like that, white Christians are by far the most conservative, the most opposed, the most against issues of justice. But the group that's often close behind are Asian Christians, practicing Christians who are Asian. In fact, they are closer to white practicing Christians than they are to Black and Hispanic practicing Christians. I have a colleague, Glenn Bracey at Villanova. He's actually working on a book looking at what's happening with all of these groups and why they're constantly showing this same pattern. But among Asians, there's a theory out there that says we don't just have a black-white binary, for example, or nor do we even have just all these separate racial groups. What we have are what's called dominant white group. We have the collective Black group, so that's African Americans, but other groups can end up there. And then we have something called in the middle, honorary white. And so minority groups often compete for the right to be an honorary white. They'll get more respect from whites. They'll get more college admissions. They'll get more of the goodies whites have to offer. And Asians are winning that competition, so to speak. But part of the deal to be an honorary white, it's like you make a pact, and that is you think like whites. So this is part of why we're finding this. And partly also, right, of course, it comes from the cultures in which Asians are, if they're immigrants or first generation, often too, they're bringing it from their own cultures. But there is this competition for most honored status to be white-like.
Why is that a problem?
That's a problem because that again feeds into the power of whiteness, right? It's when groups play that game, non-white groups play that game, whites are right. Let's say, let me make I know people hate this, but all I can think of right now is a sport analogy. I don't like the LA Lakers, and my apologies to those who love them. But in NBA these days, it's just, you have certain dominant teams, usually like the Lakers, major market, And if you're not good, you just go out and buy the very best players, and the very best players want to play there because it's LA, it's glamour, you can get into movies, whatever it is. That's kind of how our racial system works. It's unhealthy. It's an unfair competition. It says whites are what we all want to be. They really are the dominant group. It's assenting the very things whites claim they are. It's reaffirming it. And it is such a twisted view biblically of what God created us to be, who says we are all equal. So that means we would all be learning from each other equally. We all have things to offer. We all have things to learn from each other equally, but we don't live that way, not even close to living that way. So there's plenty. We're going into the field again next week to survey about 1,000 largely Christians, because we want to see if this pandemic has changed any of the things that we found from 6 months ago. Not that long ago, but the world has changed since then. So one of the things we'll be looking for, do Asian Americans think differently on any of these issues because of what the experience has been here most recently? So we'll find that out soon. Something you mentioned I think is very important. Whiteness is not for white people. That's the hardest thing for people to get. Whiteness is offered to anybody the dominant white group wishes to have. So if it behooves to maintain power, to expand to some Asian groups, it's not all Asian groups, by the way, right? Darker skinned Asian, poor Asians aren't offered this, but if it behooves to expand the definition of whiteness to some Asian groups, know that you're a pawn in that sense. You're being offered things, and by receiving those things, you are helping to perpetuate whiteness. It's kind of odd to think that, but that's exactly what it is. It's been that way. We've been saying for so many years, everything changes, folks, once whites in just a few years become the racial minority. They will never become the racial minority because the definitions will be changed to maintain majority status demographically and in every other way. We've seen it over and over and over again. You mentioned a couple of groups that's been done. Let me just quickly, my own grandfather and grandmother immigrated from Italy, 1920s. Of course, Italians are white today, but when they wrote, they came to Ellis Island, they had to write on the immigrant sheet that they came in, I forget what that name is called, but they wrote race, they had to record it, they wrote white. The clerk that checked them into Ellis Island and let them into the United States crossed white off and wrote what was a term back then, a racial term. The word was swarthy. And if you look up that word and what it meant in 1920, it meant you are a person of color. You are not white. You don't get those privileges. Over time, of course, my swarthy grandparents from Italy transitioned to being white, not because of anything they particularly did, but because it became in the best interest of other whites to say, we need Italians to be white to maintain power. So I wish people could see that. There's a game constantly being played. Do you want to be part of the game to continue the inequality, or do you want to be fighting the inequality?
That's really good. So on a practical level, so we keep going back and forth, and I think your personal stories have been very helpful. I mean, the costs that you've bore have been very helpful. Sending your kids to be the only white students or one of the few white students in a predominantly black or brown school, losing money on your home. For other whites who might be listening in, and for Asian Americans who might be listening, what are some things that they could start practically doing beyond the education? Because I think they're here because they're wanting to learn, right? And so that's one piece, but we also want our faith to be coupled with our actions. And so what are some like small things that they can be doing and some big things that they can be doing and moving forward?
Okay, so I often will say you need to pick 2 areas of life and change them. So that could mean neighborhood, church, school, workplace, friendships. It can also mean which organizations are you supporting? Which organizations are you volunteering in? Find 2, change them such that you are opposing the current racial system. You're making a decision, you're living in action that is in direct opposition to what you're supposed to do. And we could talk about what you're supposed to do, but I would venture to say that almost everybody knows what they're supposed to do. And we certainly see that in watching the data. Anytime people can move into white neighborhoods, they do. When too many of them do, white folks just leave and start a new neighborhood. So it's just an endless chase in terms of where people live. It's amazing. Just a quick study that was done in Philadelphia. There was a time where people that were sending their kids to high school could choose the high school. So they surveyed parents, what will you be looking for in high school? What do parents look for? It doesn't matter what race you are, you're looking for the best quality education you can get. So they were able to actually rank the high schools by the kind of data that people say matter: test scores, graduation rates, and all those other things we might use. So guess what? It turns out that 2 of the top 5 schools were majority Black on those measures. When they looked at what parents actually did, white parents didn't send any of their children to those schools. They overlooked those schools. They didn't even make their list. And they sent their kids to measurably worse schools by the very things they say matter because of who went to those schools. So change those things. Find 2 things, change them.
Is there anything that you'd like to conclude with? Anything that we didn't discuss that you wanted to discuss? Any final thoughts that you'd like to share, and then we'll just then we'll wrap it up.
I am very appreciative of this whole movement that's begun here, and I'd encourage people to get involved in it. Support Ray and everyone else that's doing the kind of behind the scenes work. He was telling me earlier about all the people that are volunteering. That's how change happens.